Hey there folks, so welcome to Spectrum Pulse, about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from A$AP Rocky, titled At Long Last A$AP. I gotta be honest here, I've got some issues with A$AP Mob. Now let's put aside the fact that large tracts of their content have been fraught with wordplay that's nothing special and barely rises above ignorant luxury rap. Let's ignore the fact that their usage of trap beats popularized the usage of dark, murky synth lines for this sort of hip-hop that were way more concerned with sounding menacing and tough and dark and were the first thing for being, fun or energetic, which is what you want for this sort of content. Probably my biggest issue back when I covered Trap Lord by A$AP Ferg way back in 2013 when I started this channel, even though I have warmed up a little bit to that album since then. And you know what, let's move past the fact that in terms of their content, they aren't doing much different than the same luxury rap that's clogged up mainstream hip-hop for the past 15 years. Now, I think my biggest issue with A$AP Mob is that as a rap collective, they've really underperformed in terms of actually dropping projects, and I've frequently been underwhelmed by all the hype behind this group. Hell, going back to A$AP Rocky's debut mixtape and his debut album, I was frequently more interested in the atmosphere, more melodic production than A$AP Rocky himself. And his usage of pitch-shifted, chopped and screwed vocals to give his material more swell, make it stand out a little bit more, struck me more as a gimmick than anything else. Yeah, I'm not gonna deny that he's got a good flow and a fair amount of versatility as an MC, but his punchlines and introspection have never impressed me, at all. And his choice to surround himself with more interesting rappers on tracks like One Train, which contained a murderous row of more distinctive MCs than him, struck me as a really poor choice. And sure, you can surround yourself with expensive brand names, but I'm sorry, that doesn't give you a personality. But okay, whatever. It's a debut album. You can typically expect the sophomore release to show a little bit more experimentation. And even though I'd argue that that debut didn't really define A$AP Rocky as a rapper beyond having some modest talent, he did look to be going for something that was a little bit weirder with this follow-up release. With a huge arsenal of distinctive producers and guest stars behind him, plus with the death of his mentor A$AP Yams, we could be looking at a more personal affair with this record. That could be something special. So, what did we get with it? Okay, I didn't expect a lot from this album, and to be blunt, I didn't get a lot either. Let's make it clear, I really want to like At Long Last A$AP. For as much as A$AP Rocky has branded himself as modern rap's unbridled hedonist, you can still get some fun songs out of that, but the more I worked my way through this record time and time again, the more I realized that I wasn't really having any fun. I'm not saying that At Long Last A$AP is a bad record. Like Long Live A$AP, the production and atmosphere is good enough that I can kind of enjoy it when it sustains that vibe. I can enjoy the blissed out sort of relaxed mood, but this album goes over an hour and you eventually realize that it really can't sustain all that momentum, especially when you start digging into whatever meager content is here. And with significantly weaker guest verses than his previous albums, yeah, I'm sorry, no, this album did not click with me. So okay, let's start with A$AP Rocky himself. Now, one of the things I've noticed over his albums is that he does tend to have a versatile flow, but he also tends to be a bit of a chameleon when it comes to his flows and style, following along with his guest star styles rather than develop his own unique personality and flow. The biggest example of this being on Jukebox joints with Kanye West. He's not as bad as The Game, but it is recognizable. Now, to his credit, he often mimics their styles well, and he's a good enough technical lyricist to structure his rhymes appropriately, although the number of rhyming words with themselves or completely flubbed rhymes really does push it with me. But the larger problem is that I've got a hard time getting a handle on A$AP Rocky's unique personality, considering how little I buy into all his tireless brand name bragging. I've heard it all before. It doesn't help matters, this album is a lot more languid, doesn't quite have the same intensity behind it, and A$AP Rocky just doesn't quite have Snoop Dogg's effortless, infectious charisma to make that sort of laid-back vibe really work for him. Of course, the larger problem is that A$AP Rocky's a hedonistic asshole, and he sure as hell does not make it look attractive, at least for me. Now look, there are plenty of rappers who are unrepentant dicks, and I can normally kind of tolerate it if the wordplay is strong enough, like say with Eminem, or they got enough charisma or sense of humor like T.I., or let's say Ludacris, or even if they got a lot of energy or intensity like say Lil Jon or Mystical. A$AP Rocky barely has any of that in this album. Having to listen to him sneer at an ex on Fine Wine with Future of all people, and completely waste M.I.A., and then blatantly diss Rita Ora on Better Things, I would tell him to take the high road in this sort of case, but this is also a song where he talks about trying to make out with lesbians, so that's out. I'm sorry, that's just intolerable for me. And then there's Jukebox Joints, where he says he's playing with women like sex dolls. But then again, when you have songs like Electric Body on this album, it's no surprise that he sees women as disposable objects, no matter how disgusting that is. But you want to be fair to him, it's just a facet of his endless drug-addled debauchery and brand name celebration, which even he's getting kind of annoyed with, as he said on Back Home. Although I do find it hard to buy that A$AP Rocky is such a purveyor of good taste given the unrepentant shallowness of all his rhymes, and it didn't stop him from overloading his songs with luxury brands anyway. And since the latter does absolutely nothing for me, I don't care about his brand names, I'm I'm left trying to find fragments of substance elsewhere. And I actually did find a few moments. Let me stress this. The album opens up with the Holy Ghost, a pretty pointed indictment of mega churches and the false hypocrisy there and comparing them to nightclubs in the hip-hop scene, and I can appreciate that. And the imagery was evocative enough to make you wish that A$AP Rocky actually had a point to make other than just pointing a finger and pointing out the hypocrisy. And while I actually really dug Pharsyde for at least giving A$AP Rocky a bit of rationale for his hedonism, tied to an underlying despair at having seen his world and his broken generation and not having an answer. But even despite that, in the self-awareness of his behavior on Every Day, where he calls himself a piece of shit, there's not enough depth or commentary that redeems it or makes it all that compelling because, well, unchecked hedonism and nihilism gets pretty damn boring if it's just done for its own sake. I don't get a lot out of that. So okay, fine, what about the guest stars? Well, in a nice change of pace, A$AP Rocky isn't being overshadowed on this album, but it's less because his material has improved and so much so as the majority of his guest stars' bars just blow. Future First is about as bad as usual as he continues his trend of taking bad pot shots at Sierra. Dude, you've been doing this for multiple mixtapes now. She already won with I Bet. Get over it already. And while I actually thought UGK dropped some pretty solid verses on Wavy Bone, Juicy J's just continues to frustrate me with references that feel so goddamn corny. Seriously, that Trident gum reference, that Snoopy line, really? And Kanye's verse, it was terrible. And at this point, I'm not even really surprised by Kanye dropping bad guest verses anymore. While this one was bad for structural reasons, barely even trying to rhyme or form cohesive thoughts beyond just mindless arrogance. The big disappointments for me though were Mos Def and Schoolboy Q. The former just underwhelming me with his verse. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't great either. And the latter taking A$AP Rocky's excuse to run the asshole behavior up to 11 with lines like, whip the bitch like Ike, I could fuck your bitch off hype. Lovely, dude. The one guest verse that actually did show some promise was Lil Wayne's of all people on M's. But despite the solid flow and a few good lines, really it was just more luxury rap bragging. I've heard Lil Wayne do this before. As for guest singers, well, I like the juxtaposition between Rod Stewart and Miguel on Every Day. Probably one of the few hooks that I actually kind of liked on this album. The larger problem is that the majority of the hooks are handled by this no-name guitarist from London called Joe Fox. And his voice is often so thin and drowned out with reverbs and effects and situated so far back in the mix that I rarely get a lot of impact from his hooks. They just do nothing for me. I'm sorry. But okay. Let's be honest here. Nobody's listening to an A$AP Rocky album for its content. They're going for the production, they're going for the atmosphere, they're going for the vibe. And there definitely has been a shift on this album, with the interjection of more soulful samples and moodier vibes in comparison with the straight up snapping bangers of his last album. Now, I'll argue when you have such shallow content, pairing with lethargic, overwrought presentation is the exact opposite direction that I would take, but you know what? He does get some hits here. For instance, the whole washed out guitar line of LSD against the languid synth and minimalist percussion, pretty damn potent. Probably my favorite song on this album. Hell, one of the things that I've always liked about A$AP Rocky is that he rarely ever compromises a melodic backdrop on his songs. Like the guitar and bells on Holy Ghost, the gleaming elegance of Excuse Me with the twinkling pianos and echoing percussion over the chorus, the stripped back guitar on Pharsyde with the strings and the hi-hats, those smooth, soulful horns on Wavy Bone, that great organ backdrop in Every Day, or that crushing trap bombast of M's that I even like despite those pitch-shifted shouts. Hell, to A$AP Rocky's further credit, he marginalized some of the more pitch-shifted, chopped and screwed elements that I couldn't stand on his last album. And when he brought it all back for nearly all of Fine Wine, he at least made the choice to pick up some solid drums that single-handedly saved that track from being absolute crap for me. Of course, there are some slip-ups. Lord Pretty Flacco Jody 2 has that siren synth squeal I just could not stand. The guitar tone on West Side Highway was a runny mess. And the horns that Kanye chose in the back half of Jukebox joints were so tinny and thin, they completely killed my enjoyment of that particular soulful sample. Granted, they effectively came out of nowhere, which ties into the issue I have with the transitions on this album. Namely that they feel like some of the clumsiest shifts that I've heard in a long time on a hip-hop album, which does nothing for the flow of these tracks and these albums as a whole, especially when it comes to cultivating any sort of atmosphere. I get you're trying to add variety to the sounds, but when you consider how bloated this album is and there are still instrumental ideas that feel kind of undercooked, you've got problems here, especially when the hooks aren't that good to really grab my attention. So yeah. In other words, the more I've listened through At Long Last A$AP, the more this album just frustrates me. Yes, A$AP Rocky is improving as a technical MC, but his punchlines still don't impress me. His lyrical content is a mess of hedonistic nothings and half-formed ideas that rarely come together, and none of it has the depth to merit a lack of solid hooks, driving presence, hard-hitting bars, and any sort of instrumental tightness. If it wants me to just turn off my brain, just vibe with it all, too much of the instrumentation feels melancholy, disjointed, and lacking in impact. But if it wants me to actually engage with it intellectually, and I sure as hell hope it doesn't. A$AP Rocky and his guests barely give me anything to work with. And for an album that runs over an hour, I'm sorry, that's inexcusable. For me, I'm thinking maybe a 5 out of 10 and only a recommendation if you're a hardcore fan of A$AP Mob and you just vibe with this material more. But in a year where Ludacris brought back real charisma, a great flow, and a sense of real, fun to his shallow, more commercial material on Ludaversal, I'm sorry, no excuse for this. In other words, for most part, I'm skipping this album. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else you want me to cover in the next upcoming weeks, or anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Just please keep it civil in the comments. My opinion is not an indictment on yours. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.